Tales from the Hood. Tales from the Hood is one of those movies. It's like unforgettable. I think, looking at the era of films that I grew up watching, my practical effects film guide focuses on 1980 to 1995. And I would say most of those films from that period I would have watched on VHS. I would have watched them rented from the video store with my parents. And so I have a very deep layered experience with the film Tales from the Hood. It was produced by 40 Acres and a Mule and directed by Rusty Cundieff. I was familiar with Spike Lee's films also growing up as a kid. They were very influential to me as a mixed black kid in particular because he did films like Jungle Fever and Do the Right Thing. And so these films were highly influential to me around the topic of race and dynamics between people, especially dysfunctional communication dynamics. And so Tales from the Hood came out in 1995. Films that would have been leading up to this or around the same time would have been Puppet Master, which I think is significant to one of the stories that has puppets in this film. And then Tales from the Crypt, which I also grew up watching a lot of horror, and Tales from the Crypt was the big one. And then we would have had films like Boys in the Hood, and then just the 90s and black experience as it was being demonstrated in filmmaking, kind of leading up to and throughout this time. You actually, just like with Tales from the Crypt, you have a host who's taking you through and is helping you understand the time and the place of the story, helping you get immersed in it, pointing out what the moral lessons are and what the symbolism is throughout each story. So what I think is really interesting about this film is how much it covers in such a short amount of time. In one film, you cover the following topics: drugs, racism, police brutality, murder, crooked politicians, crooked cops, black ancestors, black allegiance, domestic violence, child abuse, single parent household, death of a parent, belief, racial slurs, affirmative action, welfare, the Ku Klux Klan, lynching, slavery, reparations, plantations, racism from the South, resilience, the power of community, black storytelling, black bodies, gang violence, incarceration, the prison pipeline, in community violence, black integration with the system, gun violence. So all of these topics are covered in 4 short stories in the film, which is pretty miraculous. But I think the thing about Tales from the Hood that's so amazing, and I don't know if I can really think of anyone who's done it quite the same way, is how lighthearted it was. How do you deal with such dark topics? And all of these topics that affect the black community, particularly from a U.S. perspective, right? That's what they're talking about here. An African American black experience. How do you talk about all these dark, challenging, difficult topics in a horror film in a lighthearted way? And I think it's just a direct connection to how black people have been able to, over time, deal with hard times and keeping their chin up, so to speak, that we can tell a story that's really hard, but we can also keep a positive outlook on it. Some people use spirituality, to do that. I don't know what else to call it other than a certain type of resilience. This isn't a comedy. And I try to think about it, and I rewatch the film, and I'm like, it is a very kind of dark horror film, but that lighthearted thread is still there throughout. And one of the reasons is the practical effects. So it does have amazing practical effects. In the first story, we get to see where the story is taking place, and there's a stained glass window of the house. And I feel like the houses that are represented in the stories have this very particular kind of almost dollhouse-like quality to them, right? Like it's this imaginary, magical place. You have zombies, you know, those kind of traditional practical effects. You've got at one point where a cop kind of deteriorates from, you know, real life into becoming a piece of street art. There's fires throughout in the film. One story has like a paper cutout monster, and you get to see this kind of paper cutout process in two of the different stories. Um, the bodies, there's practical effects where like bodies are breaking and getting crushed, and there's like the gun violence practical effects where it's actually showing kind of the morbidity of the gun violence. We have puppets, again, one of the most memorable puppet movies that I can remember from that time. Plus, they're black puppets, which is also something that you wouldn't get to see in films that often, right? But these are black puppets, and they're like, and again, the practical effects, the silliness comes through, and even the violent attacks, you know, again, it's very black storytelling to me. It's like, how do you tell this? And it's so dark and twisted and sad, and then at the same time like silly, you know, just the act of it is silly. I believe there might be some claymation with the puppets. And let's see what else we have. And then in the last story, there's actually some archival footage there, and there's some light work that happens. And so we have like wounds related to the gunshots, and we have transformation of the host from, you know, spoiler alert, you know, he's like the devil basically, and his transformation in that. And so some of that practical effects work is a little bit cheesy, but again, that kind of is what wraps around that darkness, is this kind of cheesy practical effects use. And so I remember I had mixed feelings about this film, to be honest with you. You know, again, I would have watched this with my parents, and I had a complicated, you know, just to lead in and story time. You know, I grew up with corporal punishment, and, you know, when I think about it now, look back, I feel like it's abuse, it's abusive, right? But a lot of people, especially black people, we experienced corporal punishment in our homes growing up. And so there is a pretty dramatic scene with David Alan Grier involving domestic violence. And I think the fact that David Alan Grier, and I knew him as a kid, I knew him from in Living Color, and as a comedian, I think this very dark character that he plays, that juxtaposition, it was again another very deliberate decision choice. He played the role really well. He, you know, transformed well, both in the narrative of the piece, and then they physically transformed him as well throughout the process. But I can only imagine what it must have been like for me to watch that, knowing that I had the physical violence that I experienced in my home. And, you know, I think there's probably just a kind of dissociation. I don't know, I'd have to have other black folks chime in about this. And again, I know lots of people get, you know, spanked and corporal punishment, physical punishment, not just black people, but there is a certain kind of history to our corporal punishment and where that stems from, and how that has carried on, and how that has affected us. And as light skinned, as mixed race as I want to be, I also grew up with that type of violence in the home. And so I think, you know, this story shows an extreme kind of version of that domestic violence, and I think it's something that we don't really talk about, and a lot of people get passes. And I would say that I definitely gave my dad, my late father, he's passed away 10 years ago now, but I definitely gave him a pass because there were a lot of ways that he was a hero in my life, and it's really hard to look at your hero and acknowledge that he did something wrong, or that you were so badly, you know, impacted. And, you know, it's passed down generation to generation. You know, he had experienced kind of extreme corporal punishment as well. And I'm sure that my grandmother, who was known for being a disciplinarian, so much so that it was in her obituary at her funeral, that she was known to serve a punishment, you know, it kind of becomes, again, almost this lighthearted thread. And I think there's like a connection to that for Black storytelling and oral history. Because if you think about many of us who were spanked and we talk about it, eventually and over time, a lot of times it does become kind of a joke. It does become kind of a ha-ha. But it wasn't really funny when it was happening, and those psychological and emotional effects from corporal punishment is also not funny. But somehow we're able to kind of laugh it off or give people a pass. So I think that I remember being really influenced by that particular story in Tales from the Hood that involved the domestic violence, because I was a young person watching that with someone who I experienced domestic violence with. And, you know, I I think it just, I only thing I can imagine is that there was a kind of dissociation from it, because what David Allen Greer did in the scene was so extreme. I mean, he's like, I'm not going to go into it. Trigger warning too if you watch that movie, okay? In general, Tales from the Hood, trigger warning of all the things I named, right, are in that film. But it's an extreme domestic violence scene, and sometimes there's more subtle things that happen, or little moments over time that happen, that we kind of give a pass to, because it's like, see, it's not this extreme, it's not doing this, but he's maybe doing a little bit of that. And so yeah, I'm definitely totally anti-spanking, and anything of like hitting children. I don't think it's good. I'm 45 years old and I'm still recovering from those experiences. And so yeah, trigger warning if you watch this, because it's going to bring up everything that you can imagine about being a Black person in the United States that you can think of, but it will hold your hand through it with a lighthearted note that our people are known for.